In the fall of 1798, under the amber skies of rural Frederick County, Maryland, a series of unspeakable discoveries brought one of the region's most respected families under a cloud of suspicion so dense it would take over 2 centuries to fully emerge from its shadow. It started with a sealed trunk. Eerie recovered during the demolition of an abandoned estate, once belonging to Dr. Walsh, a renowned surgeon and landowner. The trunk contained brittle leather-bound journals, medical sketches, and something far more disturbing, dozens of small dried vials, each meticulously labeled with a name, date, and handwritten notes in Latin. Names of people long dead, dates that aligned with missing persons reports, and notes that suggested experimentation. Among the faded pages was a drawing, crude yet unmistakable, a human figure restrained with arrows pointing to organs, a child's body. Beneath it a scrawled phrase, Puritas per sectionem, purity through dissection. For generations, the Walsh family had been held in high regard, known for their piety, philanthropy, and medical innovation. Their patriarch, Dr. Alaric, had reportedly treated both colonists and British soldiers during the war. His clinic, perched on a quiet hillside near the Monocacy River, had served as both a hospital and a private school. No one questioned his methods or his solitude, but locals whispered about screams at night, about visitors who never returned, about wagons arriving under cover of darkness, carrying crates and children. When the estate was condemned and auctioned in 1986, historical preservationists hoped to find relics. Instead, they unearthed a horror buried beneath the eastern wing of the manor. Construction crews struck something hard, a stone chamber sealed with iron rivets. Inside were skeletons, dozens, small delicate bones, some stacked in surgical trays, some arranged like specimens. Many showed signs of incisions, saw mark, removal of eyes, hearts, and tongues. There was no official explanation. The chamber was sealed again within days, but one photograph made it out. An image of a medical ledger open to a page dated August 3rd. The entry listed a child named Elias Arts, age 9, and a brief note, subject expired mid-procedure, vocal cords removed post-mortem, purification incomplete. What had begun as a family legacy unraveled into one of the darkest, most carefully buried, medical scandals in American history. Before there was Frankenstein, before there was Dr. Mengele, there was Dr. Alaric Walsh, the man who claimed to heal by cutting away the soul. This is not just the story of a forgotten doctor. This is the legacy of the Walsh dynasty, and this is just the beginning. 1798, Maryland, a state teetering between the Enlightenment's promise and the Church's grip. The town of Elmridge sat nestled in fog-drenched woodlands and rolling clay hills, barely a whisper on most maps. To the few who lived there, it was a place of rhythm, church bells, market calls, births and burials, life measured in silence and Sunday hymns. Into this guarded simplicity, one figure arrived who would permanently disturb the town's quiet rhythm. Dr. Alaric Walsh. He came not with a family, but with crates of medical equipment, locked chests and books so thick they seemed to bend time itself. He purchased the abandoned Beechwood estate on the town's northern bluff. Locals, curious but polite, extended greetings. He responded with short nods and longer silences. His home soon became the Walsh Medical Study, an unofficial hospital, a research hall, and some said a place of unholy purpose. The church tried to be friendly. The priest visited once. He did not return. Walsh was brilliant. Even the town's elders agreed. He cured a wave of fever that swept through in 8. He designed an herbal salve that ended the town's long war with frostbite. He performed surgeries no one else dared attempt. People brought him their sick, and their dying, and on occasion, their dead. He never married, had no children, kept no known friends. No visitors ever arrived by horse or foot, and no carriages dared cross the gate unless summoned. The staff he employed were quiet and changed off. One nurse, known only as Sister Marla, stayed the longest. She was said to be mute, though some believed her silence was voluntary, a vow perhaps, and she wore a veil even in summer thick enough to obscure her entire face. For 5 years the town tolerated his eccentricity. The bell, for instance, a small but strangely resonant iron casting, hung atop the study's roofline and rang unpredictably, sometimes at dawn, sometimes just before dusk, and on more than a dozen occasions, it tolled long after midnight, when the town was silent, but for the crickets and rustling leaves. Then there were the children, always quiet, always pale, always too obedient. They came from far away. Some said Boston, others whispered of ships arriving from the coast. Officially, they were sick or malformed or beyond the understanding of their parents. Walsh called them subjects. They never played with the other children. They rarely smiled. They followed Marla like lambs to slaughter. Once, a farm boy followed one of the children home. He said he saw something, a machine the size of a wardrobe that hummed and pulsed and blinked. The boy spoke of wires embedded in the child's arm, a diagram of bones with numbers etched in foreign script. His family moved away the next month. More rumors followed, of rooms that buzzed, of screams that came not from pain, but from something else, of lights that flared even when no candles burned. But no one accused Walsh outright. After all, he had saved their kin. He had made miracles, and miracles always cost something. Then came the red autumn of 8. 3 children went missing in the same week, their beds empty, their windows locked from the inside. The sheriff questioned everyone, Walsh included. He offered his condolences and no alibis. 2 nights later, a woman named Agnes Brewer claimed to hear whispering from the woods near the Walsh estate. She followed the sound, barefoot and half-mad, and claimed she saw a circle of children standing around a fireless pit. She said Marla stood at the center holding a bell. She said it rang, but no sound came out, and yet her ears bled. No one believed her. They put her in the sanitarium, and still, amid whispers, disappearances, and growing superstition, the doctor remained. Until the morning the bell rang 13 times. Emmett Dyer was 10 years old, the youngest apprentice ever taken on by Mr. Abram Holt, the town's blacksmith. Quiet, clever, with coal-smudged cheeks and a talent for tools far beyond his age. On the day of his disappearance, he had been sent with a tin flask, an intricately designed piece, a custom order Dr. Walsh had requested weeks prior, specifying not just size but weight, insulation, and an engraved symbol he sketched himself on parchment. The request was nothing unusual for Walsh, who often sent for medical devices and storage vessels with odd specifications. Emmett had accepted the task proudly, a delivery he'd been entrusted to complete on his own. By sunset he had not returned. Mr. Holt thought little of it at first. The Walsh estate was known for delays, strange requests, long waits. But when the clock passed midnight and Emmett's mother came knocking in tears, the silence became unbearable. The search party started with lanterns and dogs. Men and boys swept the forest path to the Walsh estate. They found boot tracks, a dropped leather strap, but nothing else, just emptiness, as if the air itself had swallowed the trail. No signs of struggle. No blood. No flask. Only absence. It hung in the air like smoke seen, felt, but never grasped. Walsh answered the door in his nightshirt, a long candle burning behind him. He expressed concern, even offered his estate for searching, but the men found no sign of the boy. Walsh claimed Emmett never arrived. Sister Marla stood behind him, veil intact, unmoving. One of the searchers later said she was holding something small and metal before slipping it behind her back. They let it go. What were they to do? Accuse the only doctor within 20 miles of abducting a child? And so Emmett became the second child in 2 years to vanish without explanation. Rumors began to rot the air. A girl named Clarice had seen Marla walking barefoot through the orchard the night before Emmett vanished. One merchant swore he saw her speaking Latin, whispering incantations to a jar of pale liquid, her veil soaked with dew, her body swaying under the silver gleam of the moon like a branch in windless trance. And then came the discovery. A hunter named Thaddeus Grimm was tracking deer in the forest west of the Walsh estate when he stumbled upon something buried in loose leaves and half-frozen mud. A small hand. Emmett. His body had been folded, disjointed, bones arranged unnaturally. His eyes were missing, but there were no signs of animal disturbance. Instead, etched along his ribs were tiny carvings. Symbols. Runes, perhaps. Too clean for knife work. Too delicate for accident. Whitaker, a seasoned physician brought in from Baltimore with a reputation for forensic skill and battlefield triage, examined the remains. His hands trembled. He repeated a single phrase over and over again, as if it were the only thing left tethering him to reality. Not surgery. Design. The town cracked. Fear seeped into every corner of Elm Ridge. Children were kept indoors. Lanterns burned through the night. Church attendance surged. The priest, now older and weaker, preached of Lucifer walking among them, but he never named name. One person did. Miriam Dyer, Emmett's mother. She had lost her son and gained a fury no divine sermon could temper. She began collecting stories, details, names. She interviewed tradesmen with the skill of a detective, coaxed details from grieving families like a priest, hearing final confessions, and kept a locked journal hidden beneath her floorboards like scripture. She spoke to a sailor who once delivered a trunk to the Walsh estate marked anatomical "Do not expose to light." She found a widow who claimed her husband had disappeared the same night as a bell's late toll. Miriam now knew with awful certainty, Emmett hadn't just been murdered. He'd been used, studied, dissected for something that went beyond medicine, beyond cruelty, something ritualistic. And Sister Marla, whatever she truly was, had been involved. The problem was no one would act. The town's trust in Walsh ran deep. He had healed their wounded, delivered their children, cured their plagues. To turn against him felt like condemning the hand that had saved them. So Miriam acted alone. She broke into the estate one night under the cover of fog. She never spoke of what she saw in the cellar, but she returned with a piece of cloth she claimed had belonged to her son. It was soaked in blood, stained with ash, and etched with a single word burned into its fibers. Reconstitua, Latin for to re. That was the word that changed everything. The priest called it heresy. The sheriff said nothing. And yet, the morning after the cloth was shown to the town, the bell atop Walsh's study rang again. 13 times. And this time, everyone heard. Elias Brandt's letter wasn't the only warning left behind. On the night he fled, several townspeople reported seeing figures standing at the tree line behind the church, cloaked, motionless, silent. No one dared approach. By morning the ground was scorched in a perfect circle where they had stood. Children cried through the night, and dogs refused to go near the eastern woods. Reverend Dorsey, after collapsing mid-sermon, was found babbling in the vestry, scratching at the walls with broken nails. He spoke of a voice behind the veil, a whisper inside the hollow of the ear. He was taken to the rectory infirmary, but never recovered. He died 3 days later. His final words, "He listens through their bone." That phrase began appearing across town, carved into tree trunks, scratched into pews, even painted in lamb's blood across the town well. The people of Monocacy Hills had seen strange things before, but this was different. This was coordinated, intentional. Cutler, disturbed but determined, sent a telegram to a colleague at the College of Surgeons in Philadelphia. He received no reply, only a package. Inside was a book bound in tanned skin, its contents cryptic and disturbing. It contained sketches of surgical rituals, notations in phonetic scripts, and references to a being called Auditor. Each entry was signed with a single symbol, a bell. Samuel Caro began sleeping with a rifle across his lap, unwilling to leave until answers were found. Late one night while patrolling near the Walsh property, he heard music, not from an instrument but like humming, low and harmonic, rising from the soil. He followed the vibration to the old well behind the study. There, resting against the stones, he found a locket that once belonged to his son Emmett. Inside was a lock of hair and a tiny scrap of vellum. On it, he heard what should never be spoken. That discovery galvanized Caro. He began mapping every disappearance, every strange noise, every animal mutilation, overlaying them with the moon cycle and bell tolls. A pattern emerged, a ritual calendar pointing to an event not yet concluded. Something was still unfinished. Monocacy Hills had become a stage, and the final act was drawing near. By autumn, Monocacy Hills was no longer a town. It was a wound, raw, festering and spreading. The once golden fields now lay fallow, overgrown with weeds that seemed to pulse with their own breath. Shops stood shuttered, signs swinging in the wind like hanged men. The wind itself had changed. It no longer carried the scent of firewood or fresh bread, but whispers, low, endless murmurs that crept through the cracks in the walls and settled in the bones of the living. And always, always that damn bell. It rang with no rhythm, no pattern, sometimes twice a night, sometimes not for days. But when it did, the effect was immediate. Animals cowered beneath porches, windows slammed shut, and those who remained in town whispered desperate prayers they no longer believed in. The sound wasn't just heard, it was absorbed, felt deep in the marrow, as if the bell was not calling out but drawing something in. Inside Walsh House the rituals continued. No one saw them, but everyone knew. Lights burned at unnatural hours, candles flickered behind, drawn curtains, casting shadows that didn't match the shapes that made them. There was a pattern to the disappearances now. Every 7th week, a child was taken. No witnesses, no evidence. Doors remained locked. Yet somehow still it happened, as if something reached through the locks, through the very walls, and pulled the young into the dark. And those who once demanded justice now said nothing at all, because they had heard the voice. It began as a rumor, a strange feel, a sensation just behind the ears, not quite a whisper, not quite a hum, just beneath the surface of hearing. Some described it as a tuning fork pressed to the skull. Others said it was like someone breathing behind them, always just out of sight. The sensation intensified as one approached Briar Hill. Then the dreams began. Dozens reported the same vision. Blindingly white room, too clean, too bright. A table in the center, leather straps, a copper funnel hanging from the ceiling. And always the figure of Walsh, standing behind it all, gloved hands hovering, mouth moving in silent prayer. Except for the bell. It tolled softly in the background, no louder than a breath, but deep enough to rattle molars. Some tried to flee. A family of 4 vanished overnight, their supper still warm on the table. The next day the baby's cry echoed through the forest, but no one dared search. Others turned inward, shut their doors, burned their diaries, pretended not to hear. Even the river changed. Fishermen said the fish had vanished. The water turned strangely warm in patches, sickly warm, like breath on skin. And beneath the surface, spiral grooves began to appear, carved into the riverbed stone. Too perfect to be natural, too ancient to be new. Something's feeding, they whispered. Something old, something that listens. And through it all Dr. Walsh never flinched. He continued his errands, paid in silver, tipped in smiles. Once a woman screamed at him in the market, called him a thief of children. He approached her gently, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something only she could hear. She fell silent, walked home slowly. That night she drowned herself in her own well. Enter Caleb Vexley, a young apprentice printer from Baltimore sent to typeset new hymnals. But when he heard the stories surrounding the town, he began writing something else. A journal, a record of what he saw, what he heard, and what he could not unsee in Monocacy Hills. And he saw plenty. He lodged near the edge of the Walsh estate and often wandered after dusk. One night, compelled by the now familiar hum in his skull, he followed the sound into the woods and saw something impossible. A circle of children stood barefoot around a twisted elm tree, all silent, all facing inward. Their faces were blank, as if sleepwalking. In the center stood Elspeth, the nurse who had once greeted him kindly. Her veil was gone, her lips freshly sewn shut. Blood glistened in the moonlight. She swayed back and forth gently, arms lifted toward the star, and from beneath the earth came a wet, pulsing sound, like a massive heartbeat. Caleb stepped closer and realized the ground itself was moving, breathing. Something beneath was rising to meet them. He ran. He never spoke of it, but he wrote it down, every detail, and hid the journal inside the church bell tower. But weeks later, another child vanished. Isadora Penn, age 9. She had been drawing strange diagrams, machines that can hear the sky. She told her father. Her sketches were impossibly intricate spirals, tubes. One drawing matched something Dr. Walsh kept in his apothecary, a brass earpiece connected to tubing that ran deep into the foundation. It was called the listener. No one knew what it was connected to, or what it heard. Then came the letter, anonymous, left on the altar of the church, scrawled in precise, almost surgical handwriting. He is not studying sound. He is channeling it into himself, into something else. The bell is not to warn us, it is to feed it. The town teetered between madness and silence. But then came a glimmer of resistance. From an unlikely source, Miriam Cartwright's brother Jonas, a blacksmith, a war veteran, and a man who feared nothing, rallied a dozen men, armed, desperate. They stormed Briar Hill one cold November night. They never made it inside. By morning, 8 of them were found curled in fetal positions outside the gate, eyes wide, mouths open, ears bleeding, their weapons untouched, their faces locked in silent screams. Only Jonas survived. He never spoke again. Instead, he carved one sentence into the wall of his smithy, over and over, with his fingernails. The sound isn't heard, it's felt, in the blood. And then, the bell stopped. 3 weeks of silence, no deaths, no disappearances, which was worse, because in the silence, something else could now be heard. A heartbeat, low, slow, coming from beneath the house. A new rhythm, a new beginning. The silence that followed the last bell toll was unlike anything the town had experienced. For the first time in months, there was no hum, no tremor beneath the floorboards, no invisible pressure behind the eyes. Monocacy Hills held its breath, but beneath that temporary peace lurked a thick, ominous anticipation, like the hush before a storm that doesn't just pass over but swallows everything in its path. Inside Briar Hill, the Walsh house remained lit, its windows glowing like eyes in the dark, pulsed softly with a reddish hue, as though the house itself had begun to bleed light. The townsfolk dared not look too long. Children were kept inside, curtains stayed drawn, and the air felt wet, not with rain, but with something else, denser, heavier, as if saturated with the breath of something unseen. Elias Granger, a former railroad surveyor and amateur astronomer, was the first to notice the stars, or rather their absence. Every clear night for 40 years, he had mapped constellations from the flat roof of the church. But now the sky above Briar Hill shimmered oddly, slightly blurred, as if the air itself was warping. Whole swaths of stars seemed to wink out, and when he looked directly above the Walsh estate, his instruments failed, his compass spun in circles, his telescope cracked on its own. He packed up his journals and left town within days. Inside the house, the rituals intensified. Though the bell had fallen silent, something older had taken its place. A new rhythm pulsing not through sound but through sensation, a throbbing beneath the skin synchronized in every inhabitant of Briar Hill. Those who lived closest began walking in their sleep. They awoke in doorways, their feet muddy, their arms marked with spirals. Children were found in the fields at dawn, kneeling and staring at the horizon. They had no memory of how they got there. The Walsh siblings, however, were no longer seen. Horace, Elspeth, and Lydia vanished from public view, though deliveries to the estate increased. Crates of iron filings, medical tools, copper wiring, and glass tubing were brought in under cover of night. Gravedigger Jeb Toller claimed he saw a delivery cart tipped over near the estate, and the cargo wasn't materials but bodies. Too small to be grown, he said. Too many to be ignored. But no one believed him. Or rather, they believed, but said nothing. It was then that Miriam Cartwright reappeared, thin, pale, and with streaks of white in her black hair. She emerged from the woods barefoot, clutching her brother Jonas's journal. Her eyes were sunken but fierce. She had not spoken since the failed raid, but now she screamed. Screamed in the square, screamed at the church doors, screamed the names of the children lost. She shouted of what lay beneath the house, a device she claimed, that wasn't just used to hear but to call. It's not just feeding, she cried, it's opening a path. Miriam was arrested. Father Merritt pleaded with the town council to send her to the state asylum, but they refused. Too many had seen the truth in her eyes. Instead, she was held in the old courthouse jail, watched, fed, and questioned. She said little after her outburst, except for one night, when the sky turned a shade of violet no one could name, and she whispered, "It'll break through the veil soon, and it will not need our permission." Days later, Father Merritt was found dead in the chapel. His body was intact, but his mouth had been sewn shut from the inside. A single note was found pinned to his cassock, written in meticulous script. He spoke when he should have listened. Fear turned to paralysis. The mayor, a man named Griggs, issued a town-wide curfew. No one was to leave their home after sunset. Oil lamps were to remain lit at all times. Church bells would be rung every hour to drown out other sounds, but none of it mattered. The town was already lost, because that's when the ground began to move. It started as subtle tremors barely perceptible, but they grew day by day. Walls cracked, wells collapsed, animals fled or fell ill, and the epicenter was always the same. Beneath Briar Hill, those who stood closest reported hearing whispers in the stone, voices that seemed to speak from beneath their feet. "Come down," they urged. "Come see," and some did. Walter Hemmings, a young butcher's apprentice, broke into the Walsh estate under cover of storm. What he found was worse than any nightmare. He described it in his final letter, left behind before he disappeared the next day. He wrote of a spiral staircase, descending beneath the house, far deeper than any foundation should go, of walls covered in etched metal and bone, of machines that moved without operators, of jars filled with fluid that shimmered and hissed, and of a heartbeat steady, thunderous, and not human. But what broke him, he said, was the nursery, a room, warm and glowing, filled with hundreds of cribs, each empty, each rocking gently, as if unseen hands comforted invisible infants. A lullaby played on a loop, a song no one in the town knew, but which every reader of his letter claimed to recognize. Some said it matched the tune the church bell had once played. Others said it was older, much older. The letter ended abruptly. "It's not becoming," he wrote. "It already is." And just like that, the final barrier fell. The people of Monocacy Hills, those who remained, began preparing, not for survival but for sacrifice. Offerings were left on porches, raw meat, teeth, dolls. One family, the Penbrooks, left their newborn on the Walsh steps. By morning, the child was gone, and a spiral had been carved into their front door. No one questioned it, because the sound had returned, not the bell, but something deeper, a resonance that made water shiver and skin crawl. It came not from the air, but from inside the mind, and it spoke one word, over and over in 1,000 voices. December 31st, 1798. A full moon hung low, casting a cold silver veil across the Monocacy Hills. Monocacy. Snow had fallen in thick, quiet drifts, blanketing the town in false serenity. It was the final night of the century, and every home, every heart, knew something was coming. The heartbeat, once faint like a distant war drum, had grown into a relentless throb. It pulsed beneath floorboards, within the walls, and inside the chest cavity of every man, woman, and child. No one spoke of sleep anymore. Instead, they watched, wide-eyed behind boarded windows, their candles flickering to nothing. Briar Hill rose over them all, not as a home but a monument to dread. The Walsh house remained lit, its windows glowing like eyes in the dark, pulsing steadily as though breathing. But the stillness was staged. Inside the estate, Elspeth stood within the observatory turned sank. Her lips were sewn shut with golden thread, yet they moved, emitting a vibrational hum that resonated in the bones more than the ears. Her language was unearthly, something ancient, mathematical, and utterly inhuman. Before her stood the completed listener, no longer a mere machine, but an amalgam of brass, bone and sinew. Its spine antennae stretched unnaturally, its dial spun freely, ticking to a rhythm known only to the stars. At her side, Dr. Horace Walsh had shed the last of his humanity. His robe, now stitched from anatomy texts and torn hymnals, draped his skeletal frame. His eyes had turned fully black, glassy voids. He was not a doctor, he was a conduit. He lifted a scalpel etched with sigils not found in any book, and whispered, "In silence we suffer. In silence we open. Let the 13th ring commence." Then from the dead valley below, the bell rang. Once, and then again, with each toll the town convulsed, as though the sound reached past skin into marrow. On the 12th chime, chaos erupted. Windows shattered, oil lamps exploded, people screamed and dropped to their knees. The 13th ring did not sound like a bell. It sounded like bones snapping, teeth grinding, lungs emptying. It wasn't heard, it was experienced. Then absolute silence. No wind, no memory, no time. That silence lasted exactly 13 minutes. Then the ground split beneath Briar Hill. From the rupture emerged, not a being, but an echo made flesh. Faceless except for a sewn mouth of gold thread, it shimmered between bone and shadow. It walked without steps, it mourned without tears. Wittenthus felt no fear, they felt regret. Across Monocacy Hills, people collapsed, not in prayer but surrender. And inside the estate, Dr. Walsh opened his arms. The being entered him like vapor. No scream, only transformation. He stood taller, darker, humming. He turned to Elspeth, now trembling, and placed a hand on her head. The listener screamed, a pulse of color static, and spinning dials. Then came the signal, a sound not of this earth, one that passed through time itself. In the days that followed, nearby counties reported bizarre events, newborns speaking ancient tongues, clocks reversing, livestock born inside out. The Walsh estate, deemed cursed, was set ablaze, but the flames failed to claim it. The land cracked and swallowed it whole. Monocacy Hills was abandoned, and in the place where the listener once stood, a sound persisted. Soft, rhythmic, eternal, click, click, click. The dial was still spinning. The silence that blanketed Monocacy Hills after the 13th ring was thick enough to drown in. No birds sang, no dogs barked, no clocks ticked. Time had suspended itself, refusing to bear witness to what came next. In the empty churchyard, snow fell upward, returning to the sky like pale embers. Those few who had survived the listener's cry wandered the streets with shattered pupils and whispered math instead of prayers, their mouths forming fractal patterns, nonsensical yet oddly rhythmic. But Briar Hill stood untouched. The Walsh estate appeared as it always had, grand, aloof, immortal, its windows glowing faintly, like eyes that no longer blinked. Inside, the newly inhabited form of Dr. Horace Walsh stood at the observatory window, utterly still, tasting dimensions beyond atmosphere. His arms extended too far, bones forgetting how to stop growing. His skin glistened like waxed porcelain. His head tilted in deliberate slow angles, like a needle seeking signal. Elspeth sat beneath the brass limbs of the listener, rocking gently, eyes closed, whispering incantations from a book with no cover and no beginning. "It is done," she murmured, her lips barely parting, voice distant and childlike. The listener itself had changed, its gears pulsing like heart valves, its antennae arched skyward in prayer, inner dial spinning to a buried rhythm. The sound, a low hum, could only be heard beside it, but once heard it burrowed into thoughts like a hours after the signal's release. Unnatural events rippled outward, animals born with reversed spines, snow in geometric spirals, newborns speaking ancient Greek, yet Monocacy Hills remained sealed. Trains passed it by, maps erased it, roads bent around it as if obeying a new law of physics. Then came the return of the dead, not as ghosts, but as listeners' children thought long buried, now knocking on doors of demolished homes, speaking in static, smiling with empty eyes. When let in, they never left. Elspeth called them the reinstated, not ghosts, but echoes made real. She began recording her revelations in the archive of unbecoming, volumes filled with fevered entries, dream prophecies, anatomy as constellations, nerves like circuits. One entry read, "We are not the first host, we are not the last bell. The listener has called before, it will call again." She no longer slept, living in the library, candles unmelting, eating dried roses soaked in ink. Visitors were met with questions like, "Have you brought the 13th question?" And the dial must finish spinning. She only referred to herself as we. Meanwhile, the entity within Horace walked the estate perimeter each morning, precisely 33 steps. Wherever he walked, grass died, birds silent. On day 7 he touched the town's last bell. It shattered with underwater thunder. On day 8, a child was born to Miriam Clark, who had never been pregnant. The girl, aged 12 with golden eyes and brass runes down her spine, spoke, "The 13th is here." By day 10, Elspeth's journals filled themselves with fluid script humming audibly. When burned, flames turned blue and froze midair. The people of Monocacy Hills knew the town was lost. Some whispered apologies to forgotten gods. Others vanished, leaving hollow clothes behind. Cemetery gates opened nightly at 3:13 a.m. and resealed before dawn, and always at the center of it all stood the listener, spinning, counting, listening, preparing. The name Walsh no longer rings through hospital halls or echoes in medical lectures. It has been surgically removed from textbooks, scrubbed from research archives, and blacklisted from modern academic circles, but the legacy remains, not in memory, but in resonance, because you don't need to remember something for it to affect you. You just need to hear it. In 2021, a research team investigating low-frequency disturbances near old rail lines in Maryland stumbled upon a subterranean chamber beneath miles of rock and forgotten earth. What they thought was an abandoned vault turned out to be an oval-shaped cavern, smooth, warm to the touch, despite the cold air, with scorched copper veins running like arteries along its walls. In its center stood the remnants of a bell mechanism, its frame collapsed, wires strung through what looked like vertebrae. It didn't look abandoned, it looked paused. A nearby jar contained a perfectly preserved journal fragment with 3 words, "Do not listen." But it was already too late. Lead technician Dr. Ray Mullins described feeling watched by the air itself. She heard a hum that grew louder near the bell stand. Team recordings reported hallucinations, dreams in unknown tongues, and a growing urge to complete the circuit. One technician, Oliver, whispered, "It needs a heart," while tearing apart an antique phonograph. Another began bleeding from his nose after pressing his ear to the wall, murmuring, "The hinge isn't closed, just paused." Within 48 hours, half the team quit. The U.S. Geological Survey declared the site unstable and flooded it with cement, labeling it a collapsed shaft. Yet the humming never stopped. Reports spread globally, Musicians in Poland dreamed in time signatures of 7 and 13. A child in Sri Lanka tapped out rhythms matching Walsh's old inscription. In Guatemala, a boy drew the listener identical to the original on his school wall. He'd never seen the design. He said he heard it through the static. Back in Monocacy Hills, phones cut out. Radios jumped stations at 3:13 a.m. Bells rang without touch. Dogs barked at silence. In Frederick, an elderly man with no ID repeated, "We rang the bell 13 times. The echo never ends." He gave his name as Conrad, but records show Eli Conrad died in. Military files are redacted, but underground radio networks claim to have decoded a hidden signal in oceanic static. The result? A question. Do you hear it yet? This is not a ghost story. The Walsh family weren't haunted. They were resonant. They believed human biology could be rewritten by frequency, and they were right. We are sound. We dream in pulses, breathe in rhythms, live in vibration. Every atom, every cell trembles with potential, and frequencies can be changed. That's the Walsh legacy. Not an empire, but a note held so long it distorts into something monstrous. Elspeth called it the Archive of Unbecoming. Its final volume self-writes in glowing glyphs that hum when one researcher fainted just handling a page, waking up speaking Aramaic from the Book of Enoch. The listener is no longer a device, it's a pattern, an idea, a virus of sound. It lives in jingles, old clocks, rhymes you don't remember learning. It hides in static. It waits in silence. What happens when a perfect frequency spreads across enough minds? You get harmony or collapse. Somewhere the bone dial is still spinning. Somewhere the 13th toll still echoes. And somewhere maybe now you're listening. Stories like this aren't meant to end. They taper off, like the dying note of a bell still vibrating, even when your ears insist it's gone. The Walsh dynasty may be buried beneath history, but their legacy isn't something you can exhume with shovels or burn out with fire. Their work wasn't just science, it was resonance. A frequency so ancient it bypasses language, memory, even death. They weren't trying to invent a new kind of medicine. They were trying to translate a sound older than mankind. And they succeeded, but in doing so they tapped into something far beyond understanding, a consciousness not bound by flesh or time, but by vibration, something that doesn't need to speak to control. Something that only needs to be heard once. Maybe the bone dial was a mistake, or maybe it was a door. Either way, it was opened. And the 13th toll, that wasn't a warning. It was a signal, a pulse sent out into the world across wires, across bloodlines, across belief. It didn't stop when the bells fell. It didn't end with the last Walsh. It became part of us, in every hum you can't explain, in every flicker of static on your screen, in the rhythmic creak of your house settling at night. You felt it, you just haven't named it, but now you have. The list